Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the Center of Teaching and Learning for inviting me. I already had a chance to meet many people yesterday during the first workshop. Just wanted to say hi to all the people online as well. So at the university, I have two major roles. As a researcher, I direct the Education and Cognition Lab. So I'm interested in understanding, how do human beings learn effectively? And then how can we use that information to design better educational practices and training? And then, as Gavin mentioned, I also teach a gigantic introductory psychology class. It's even bigger than the one at Queen's. We have 3,000 students per semester. That could be a whole other talk, but it's a really fun job. I absolutely love doing it. Working with first-year students coming straight from high school, I think part of my job is helping them transition into a university setting and learning how to learn. Because I think the typical high school student that gets into a top university, they probably have a good working memory. They probably could just memorize everything, and they could probably do just fine. And then when they get to university, it's a bit of a wake-up call. So what's in common between these two major roles is something that Gavin alluded to. I'm interested in understanding the conditions that lead to durable learning. What do I mean by durable learning? It means you know the information, you've mastered it, and you can apply it into a novel situation. So it's information that will stick with you beyond this week's quiz, beyond the midterm, even optimistically beyond the final exam. I actually hope that students are walking around after my course ends and their decision making is being influenced by things that they've learned in my class. So they'll recognize, wow, that's just a cognitive bias, or that's just a confirmation bias, or that's just a representative heuristic, and I'm not going to fall victim to that. That is what I optimistically hope for. So on the very first day of class, I asked my students a question from the cognitive reflection test. And the point of this question, it's a very simple math question, and I'm going to show it to you in a moment. And the point is, I want students to become aware of how they think about problems. How do they solve problems? How do they learn? And I'll just give you a warning. Half the students in my class get this question wrong. So that's your challenge. Can you actually get this question right? Okay, here we go. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does each item cost? So I want you to let that sink in and come up with an answer. There's no tricks here. It's just a straightforward math question. Would anyone like to volunteer an answer? Okay, one person, two people, three people. Okay, how about right here in the purple? So how much is each item? Correct. That is the correct answer. $1.05 and 5 cents. The most common answer when people make a mistake, which is half the class, is they say $1.10. But that would be a 90-cent difference. So how can you actually get the correct answer? Well, okay, if the bat costs $1 more, together they cost $1.10. Let's subtract $1. We're left with 10 cents. We have to divide that 10 cents equally between the two items. So we have 5 cents and $1 plus 5 cents. 5 cents and $1.05. So when I asked the students, the ones that got it wrong, half the class, why did you say $1.10? And their answer is, well, seems like the right answer. It felt like the right answer. And I asked, did you actually do a calculation? Yeah, I did. Actually, you didn't. You just went with what felt like the right answer, and you didn't bother doing the simple calculation. That's fine. I just want them to be metacognitively aware of how they're approaching a problem. They want to go with the easiest feel-good thing. Okay, so I ask my students, now that does everyone understand the explanation I just gave? Everyone says, yeah, of course we do. If I gave you this question on the final exam for a bonus mark, would you get it right? Everyone says, of course. Of course we would get this right. Okay. Now, the challenge I think that students face coming from high school, in part, is just the volume of information, right? So they have to consume huge volumes of information, and then they have to retain that knowledge. And then remember, we're trying to teach critical thinking in university, right? They can't just memorize something. And so one way we could see how well they actually master the concept is, can they apply this newly retained knowledge in a novel scenario? Okay, I'll give you an example. Students in my class learn about something called Pavlovian conditioning, which you probably heard about. I could ask a question that I would classify as a near transfer of learning question. So it's almost exactly what they could have memorized. So here's a question that would be at that level. In Pavlov's classic experiment with dogs, what was the role played by the meat powder? Now, to answer this question, you could remember exactly what I said in lecture, not even really understand what any of these terms mean, and you could come up with the correct answer, the unconditioned stimulus. But if I want to test to see how well they've actually mastered this concept, I have to ask what's called a far transfer of learning question. I have to give them a novel scenario, one that they can't simply apply their memorization to. So, right after a rat smells menthol, it's always given drug X, which causes drinking. Eventually, the rat drinks whenever it smells menthol, even when it's not injected with drug X. In this situation, what is the role of drug X? This is the same question. It's testing the exact same concept, but if you simply memorized, you would find this question harder to answer. But if you actually understand the terms and what Pavlovian conditioning is, this is a pretty trivial question. Okay. Now, remember those students that said, yeah, of course I'd get that question right. Later on in that same lecture, I said, okay, I got a question for you. A BMW and a Tesla cost $160,000. The BMW costs $100,000 more than the Tesla. How much does each car cost? I'd say about 30% of the class gets this question wrong. After just 10 minutes ago, they said, yeah, of course we're going to get it right. Yes, I understand. You didn't. You weren't paying attention. And so I do this from the very first class to get them into the mode of thinking and really committing to actually paying attention. Okay. So yesterday, I gave a workshop on workflows, productivity, and one of the points I emphasized, I made a bit of a distinction between a goal and a system, right? So a goal might be to run a 10K race, but a system might be to embody what it is to become an actual runner, right? So something that goes beyond. Similarly, when it comes to teaching, especially because I teach so many first-year students, I think it's part of my responsibility to bake into the design of my course methods for teaching students how to learn, because they've never really formally learned how to learn. And part of my job is to also make them excited and motivated to become a lifelong learner, someone that just wants to solve problems just for the sake of solving problems. So activating a system of durable learning that you build into your instructional design extends beyond any individual goal of a student, like I want to get an A+ in this class. That is my goal. Okay. Now, when it comes to motivation, so first, to back up, I'm interested in the science of learning. And, you know, at some point in the future, I think we're going to figure it all out. At some point, we're going to say, you need to learn this in this context at this future point and be able to demonstrate this level of proficiency. I think we're going to figure it all out. We'll figure out the details. Here's exactly what you should do. The harder part is getting people to do it, right? So that's the connection between motivation and the science of learning. So when students talk about their goals, like I want to get an A+ in this class, I asked them to think back to a time when you didn't actually even care about grades. You just wanted to understand how the world works, ask questions, solve problems. And so I live with someone like that. This is my daughter, Monica. And what she's doing here is she's just testing out the hypothesis of whether or not snowflakes could be caught on their eyelashes. Why? No reason. She just wants to see if she could do it. When she was around 4, she asked me the classic kids question: does the light in the fridge go out when you close the door? And rather than just kind of reflexively give her an answer, I asked her, I don't know, what do you think? And her immediate reaction was, I don't know either, but we're going to find out. And so I said, well, how can we do that? And she sat there, thought for a moment, and she said, I know what we're going to do. Let's take everything out of the fridge. We'll take out all the shelves. I'll go inside. You close the door, and I'll tell you what happened. And I said, that's such a great idea. And when I was a kid, we could do that, but it's illegal now. So we can't really do that anymore. But I love the thought process, the active problem solving. And for me, what I loved is that it's the spirit of learning. She just wants to figure things out. And I do actually optimistically want my students to hang on to that feeling, carry it with you so that you become a lifelong learner. Okay. Now, that opening question from the cognitive reflection test, I think it's really important to help build your own metacognitive awareness about how you are learning, because just in general, the entire literature on metacognition in psychology demonstrates that humans are really bad at it. We make poor metacognitive judgments, especially about our own learning. So Dunlosky and colleagues did this systematic meta-analysis. They looked at a variety of studies, classroom interventions, controlled lab studies, and they also polled students, actual students. You have an upcoming midterm. What is your go-to method to prepare for that midterm? And here's a variety of different techniques that you can use. Not surprisingly, the most common techniques were highlighting and rereading your notes or textbook. Now, if you actually look across the research studies, you can categorize each of these techniques based on what the data shows as either having low, moderate, or high utility. How much do you actually gain from using these study techniques? And you could see that the two most common popular methods, highlighting and rereading, actually score very low when it comes to experiments that have actually looked, okay, students are doing this, how do they do on the actual midterm? So students typically on their own are doing the wrong thing. Lots of reasons why that might be happening. Like I said, in high school, if you have high working memory capacity and you could memorize things and cram at the last second, and if the questions are really testing how well have you memorized things, you're probably gonna do just fine. But when you move into a higher education setting with a greater volume of information, that no longer works. But another reason why these methods persist is because they kind of feel good. They feel right. So if you are a diligent student, you're sitting at this desk, you're getting ready for your midterm, you're rereading and highlighting your notes, and you're sitting there for hours. And the textbook, if you have a print textbook in front of you, the pages are one color. And then at the end of your labors, they're another color. There is evidence right here that physical labor has taken place. You can point to it. Look, everyone, look at what I did. I've been doing this for hours, and it feels really good. Part of that feeling good is called a sense of fluency. So when you can read the same sentence over faster and faster, it creates a sense of fluency. And it's very easy to accidentally misattribute what that fluency means. Just because you can read something faster and faster does not mean you actually understand it or have mastered it. And so people who engage in this practice exclusively feel good, and you almost feel like I deserve a good grade on this test. Look at all that has taken place. Okay, now from the instructor point of view, most people who walk into a university class have had little to no training in pedagogy or the science of learning, and yet we expect them to, okay, here's the courses you're teaching, do a good job. And they have no idea. They have no idea about the theory. They've never read a scientific article about teaching and learning and pedagogy. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to probably go back to, well, how did your university instructors and teachers teach their classes? And you're probably going to emulate that. Okay, this unfortunately leads to lots of practices that are not really backed up by actual scientific data. And like one that I'll pick on is learning styles. So the idea of learning styles is really great. And if you type in learning styles, you'll see 10,000 hits and lots of very strong advocates. And a strong version of this theory is that we can diagnose what is your preferred learning style: auditory, visual, tactile. Then we can match up the teaching to that preferred learning style, and then that will lead to increased academic performance. It's a very straightforward experiment. The problem is no one has actually demonstrated any data that shows when you match the teaching to the preferred learning style, you lead to improved academic performance. The original theory of, there were 3 original learning styles. There are now dozens of learning styles. And there are even preschools that have used psychometric tests to literally label their children with their preferred learning style. And then the idea is that the preschool teacher is going to somehow cater to each of these preferred learning styles to lead to better outcomes. The Onion picked up on this. Parents of nasal learners demand odor-based curriculum for this. I think there's a reference to like a speak and smell textbook. But I just want to point out the problem here is that if you are highly investing in something that does not have really scientific data or backing it up, you might be taking away resources from something else that you can be investing in. And psychometric testing for learning styles is a multi-million-dollar business. And a lot of my students from high school, about half the class said, yeah, they underwent a formal testing for it. Here's a poster from a grade school teacher that says kinesthetic thinkers tend to look downwards, auditory thinkers tend to look straight ahead, and visual thinkers tend to look upwards. What does that mean? And where do they get this from? I have no idea. But it's just another example of kind of investing time and resources and energy into something that does not actually have strong evidence to back it up. So there are lots of other things along these lines that I don't have time to go through. But I think my point here is that I think the major pedagogical decisions and approaches that we make for instructional design should be based on evidence that has been evaluated. Okay, so I'll talk about a few things. One might seem like a very obvious point is that learning begins with effortful and focused attention, something I talked a bit about in our workshop yesterday. And then I'll go over the classic 3 big study sessions that directly set the stage for learning that both instructors and students alike are encouraged to adopt. And then if we have some time, I want to squeeze in some brand new data that we have in an upcoming paper that's just about to be published. Okay. So for those of you who came yesterday, I talked about this study, but I think it's worth repeating. The focused attention is something that the entire class really needs to commit to doing, because the way that other people behave in a classroom impacts each individual learner in that classroom. So when everyone kind of buys in to a classroom and sets an active, positive learning environment, it has ripple effects. If everyone is late, no one and people aren't paying attention, they're doing other things on their laptops, it's distracting for everyone. So here's a informative study done by my colleague Farid Sana. Imagine a lecture hall just like this. All of the participants in the study do not have a laptop, so they can't just go phone. They can't just go online and start doing multitasking. But spread out throughout this lecture hall are some Confederates who are in on this experiment. They're posing as participants. They do have a laptop. They are also taking notes, but occasionally they start multitasking. They'll check emails, send messages, do all sorts of things like that. So if you're a participant in this study, based on where you've been seated, you may have a view of a Confederate who is occasionally multitasking. Or based on where you're sitting, you may not have a view of someone who's a multitasking peer. And then we can do all sorts of measures like how much do they mind wander? But let me just show you the data on how they actually do on the test that they were promised is going to happen at the end of this lecture. If you have a view of someone multitasking, you do significantly worse on this test. And what I want you to think about is that these participants didn't have the chance to actually multitask themselves. They were just seeing someone else multitask. So similarly, when you're on your computer and you're writing up your report and you have your email app open, you're not opening the email, but then you see the badge count go up steadily. Even though you're not opening that email, part of your mind is drifting and being focused away from the primary task of writing up that report. So similarly, even though you're personally not engaging, just seeing someone else multitask can be distracting. So this is something that I encourage my entire class again on the first day. We all agreed to be here at this time and place, so let's make the most of it and commit. Okay. Now, another concept that I'm really interested in is how long can people sustain their attention for? And this is going to vary from individual to individual. So imagine I could measure attention level, and there's various different ways that psychologists do this. And across time, what you're going to see is that you start off really good paying attention, and then that starts going down. And at some point, let's say for this person, right at the hour and a half point, there's this big drop. And so even though you continue to invest time into studying, you're not getting as much return. So if you look at the area under the curve after 1.5, it's a lot less than before 1.5. That might be a time for taking a strategic break. And so when you actually look at the study habits of students, really diligent students, what they'll say is that I'm just going to sit here until I know everything and sit there even for an extended period. But if you keep rereading the same sentence and you're not even following it, you're probably not getting that much return on this investment of time. So that might be a time to take a strategic break. And believe it or not, there are people like me that study what should you do on your break? What is the best type of break you should do? How long should it be, et cetera? And let me just show you one study that we did. But first of all, is anyone here teach a 3-hour night class? Yeah, okay. It's very challenging. I definitely have colleagues that do that. On the first day of class, there's typically a question like this that's asked to the students. Okay, we're here together for 3 hours. We have a set amount of information we have to go through. We can have a couple of breaks, and then I'm going to use up the whole 3 hours, or I can just try to push through and let you get out here as early as possible. When students are given these two options, everyone chooses option 2. and you just plow through without any breaks. But that kind of goes counter to what I just said. Having some strategically placed breaks might actually be better and using the entire 3 hours. Okay, so what should you do during the breaks? Exercise? Why not? I'm interested in exercise cognitive function interactions, among other variables. So one of the things that we really want to look at was an exercise break. Why? Well, there's some theoretical reasons. Increases arousal, helps you to focus attention. When you pay better focus attention, you can encode memories better. Okay, so we had one condition called the hero condition, where they had no breaks. These students were studying 1 week's worth of very complex material. They were motivated because they're in the course. This is a future unit that they're studying anyway, so it's kind of to their best interest. They were studying the neuroscience of form perception, very complex, dense material. 1 week's worth of material, they just kept studying. They had no breaks. Another group, we gave them some strategic breaks, 5-minute breaks on 3 different occasions. They got to do something rewarding. They played a video game that they self-reported, I really like playing this video game. So 3 times we gave them a 5-minute break to play this video game and said they really enjoyed having that break. The third group, instead of playing video games, they had to do exercise, but not just any exercise. We were a little sadistic. We made them do high intensity interval training exercise. Their heart rates, went very high for this. I would characterize as mainly sedentary group of students. They were sweating. So for 5 minutes, it was like burpees, jumping jacks, all that good stuff. So I'll show you a couple of measures. First, we measured how well are they actually paying attention from the first half to the second half of study. So what you typically see is that you start off strong, and then the second half, it kind of drifts, right? And so that's what we see here in the no breaks condition, the gray circles. You start off pretty good, and then by the second half, it dips down a bit. Here's what's really interesting. The group that got to do something fun during their breaks, the non-exercise computer game group, they showed the exact same pattern. So you start off strong, but then it dips in the second half. But the really intriguing group was the group that we made them do exercise. They maintained their attention from the first half to the second half. And then we were interested, well, how does this translate into actual performance on the test, both immediately, and we also brought them back 48 hours later for a bit of a long-term retention of information. And we can see that the exercise breaks groups outperformed the other 2 groups. Now, it's something that we've been continuing to look at. What is the exact level? Does it have to be high intensity interval training exercise? Probably not. Here's some other things that we're looking at, like a 5-minute stretch, maybe just changing the context from this complex cognitive task to a social context by writing a gratitude letter and sending it, progressive relaxation, nature reflection, even listening to a meditation track, and even having a nutritious snack. What we think makes a good break, even just a 5-minute break, is that it's restorative in nature. It shifts the context to potentially replenish attention, motivation, and energy. I'm never going to expect that it's going to make you brand new again, like the beginning of the session. But if it at least stops the downward trajectory, that's a good thing. And if it boosts you back up a little bit, that's even better. And so from a work context, if you're working all day long, all morning long, and then on your lunch break, your break is checking email, it's not really a break, right? You're just shifting from one cognitive task to another cognitive task. So it's almost like that video game group. They're doing a complex cognitive task, and now they're shifting to a fun cognitive task. So it's not really a restorative break. So the best thing that I would suggest that you do is, if you can, go for a 30-minute walk in nature. Reportedly the best thing that you can do. Okay. So far we talked about maintaining effort-filled and focused attention increases with difficulty and with the time on task, especially when we're talking about extended periods like 3 hours. One thing we could do to reduce attention lapses is to have so-called active learning, like even just a quiz question. I always have like a couple of questions up for discussion within my lecture or some sort of activity or demonstration. And when long sessions are required, actually having restorative breaks. So if you're teaching a 3-hour night class, maybe a 10-minute break where you can really get people to get up out of their seats and do something, shift the context so that they can reset a bit for the second half of the class. Okay, I promised you I would talk about 3 key principles that have emerged from the science of learning literature. And the first is retrieval practice, and it's critical for consolidating that initial memory. So here is, what a student typically does with simply rereading. So very common practice, midterms coming up, and what students end up doing is kind of passively rereading their notes, rereading the textbook, or highlighting. Now, at some level, you're going to have to do some reading, obviously, to gain the initial information. But if that's all you do and you don't make it more active beyond that, it becomes a very passive learning process. So let me just walk you through a classic study by Roediger and Karpicki in 2006. Participants in this study were reading short GRE passages. So these are short reading comprehension passages. It takes you about 5 minutes to read. For one type of passage, you would read the passage once, takes you about 5 minutes, and then you would come back and you would read that same passage again, and then you would come back, you would read it again, and then you would come back and you read the same passage 4 times in a row. We could contrast that with a second passage where you read it for 5 minutes, come back, read it again for 5 minutes, come back, read it again for 5 minutes. And then finally, on the 4th session, instead of rereading it again, you have to actively retrieve what are the main points of the article? What are the key themes? What ties everything together? You have to actually retrieve from your memory. You can't look at the passage anymore. You have to actually actively do this. And we can contrast that with a third article that participants had to read. They read it once for 5 minutes. Then they came back for a second after, and they said, well, what are the main points? Then they had to do that again. What are the key themes? Then they came back one more time. How does all this tie together? So they're actively retrieving. So what I want you to pay attention to here is that the total time on task for these 3 articles is the same. They spent 20 minutes for each of these 3 articles, but they did kind of different activities for each article. And the question was, in 1 week, how much would they actually recall? How much did this actually sink in? Each of these 3 articles. Now, if you ask the participants in the study in 1 week, we're going to be testing you on this, which of these articles do you think you'll do best on? Not surprisingly, the participants will say, well, that article that I read 4 times, I'm pretty sure I'm going to remember more of that than the article I only read once, which makes intuitive sense. But here's how they actually did. Here's the article that they read 4 times in a row. Here's the article that they read 3 times and they had to practice retrieving once. And here's the article that they read once and then had to practice retrieving 3 times. So this is a classic demonstration that just reading is not enough. It's too passive. You have to actually practice retrieving that information. Okay. Why does this work? Lots of different potential theoretical reasons. One, by practicing retrieving information, it can also kind of direct your attention to relevant information, so help you kind of focus your attention better. On the day of the test, you're actually retrieving information from your memory. And so it's the same, that process that you need on the day of the test, you should be practicing that before the test. If the first time you practice retrieving information is on the day of the test, that's not as good. You should be practicing that skill before the test. And then finally, this is much more theoretical, but cognitive psychologists believe that every time you retrieve a memory, it strengthens the neural network. And it also might add multiple retrieval routes to get to that memory. So it's a much richer network for your future use. So that's kind of the theory behind it. But I'm an applied cognitive psychologist. I always kind of think, yeah, that's nice in the lab, but show me the real deal in actual classroom. So here is a grade school science class. Study done by McDermott et al. Throughout this science class, they mixed up the lessons so that they were taught slightly differently, each unit of this science class. One unit, it was taught in their classic way. And remember, this is a real classroom. So the teacher is actually delivering these classes. There's no reviewed material. The second unit of this science class, the teacher taught as normal, as she normally did, and then she gave a document to the students that summarized everything, and they could reread through the main points of the lesson. The third type of lesson gave the same typical teaching lesson, and then the students had to practice retrieving. What was the main points of today's lesson? How does this connect with what you already know? They had to answer all of these questions on their own. So 3 different types of science lessons. So not to get too technical, but then they counterbalance this and they spread this out throughout the semester. So some science lessons were taught in their classic way, some with rereading material provided, and some where their students are prompted, okay, what did you actually learn? Now, you could look at durable learning by seeing, well, how well do they do at the end of the chapter test? And then in the longer term, at the end of the semester, how well do they do on the final exam? And we could trace back to what type of lesson did they have. So here's how they did. In the end of chapter test, after each science unit, in the non-reviewed, the classic, this is their baseline, students score about 55% at the end of the chapter, and it dips down a bit at the end of the semester to 43%. What happens when you provide them with a reading sheet that could reread, that summarizes the lesson? It goes up to about 62%, and then that dips down to 50% on the final exam. But the third condition, where you give the lesson and then the students have to practice retrieving what are the main points and make the connections, 81%. And then that dips down to about 66% on the final exam. So here is a great example of how just modifying the instructional design has a huge impact on how students are actually learning and even approaching their lesson. Okay, so just a couple examples from my introductory psychology class. I'm always getting students to practice retrieving information. So before the class begins, I might put something like this, what's the most interesting thing that you learned in class last time? Or what was the most confusing thing? Or what would you have liked to learn more about? Anything to kind of get them to think about information from last class. I want them to realize you can't just forget what we talked about last class. It's all important and it all connects together. Also, a classic university course has infrequent high stakes testing, like 2 midterms and the final exam. In my course, we have a small stakes quiz every week. We have 1 midterm, 1 final exam, and they are always cumulative. And so this builds in like weekly regular practice for retrieval. Okay, now one note about these quizzes. How do I do weekly quizzes for 3,000 students? We do them online. We have a very large bank of test questions, multiple choice, that are FAR transfer questions that we're constantly adding more to. But students could get into groups of people and help each other. And I realized that. And rather than just pretend it wasn't happening, I openly acknowledged, I said, this is like an assignment. You are welcome to form groups of people. I recommend a group of at most 4 people, and you can do the quizzes together. Because we really try to design our questions like you can't just look up the right answer. We're creating novel scenarios, and you have to really understand the concepts. And if students are debating with each other, no, it's got to be this one. I think there's a lot of learning happening there. So we kind of openly acknowledge, yes, of course you can get into groups. We actually even provide a discussion forum for shy students who can't find anyone to work with, so that everyone has an option to work with someone. Now, I suspected that the role that you play in your group has an impact in how well you actually do. So one year, I asked this question as a bonus question on the final exam. I said, you may have chosen to write the weekly quizzes in groups. Which of the following best describes your involvement in the group, right? Whatever they get, say they get a bonus point. So option A, I wrote my quizzes on my own. About 40% of students said, yeah, I actually prefer writing them on my own. It's a little bit too confusing, too many people shouting. It's a little bit too anxious. I actually prefer doing them on my own. Okay, that was interesting. Another option, I actively listened and I absorbed the discussion. I actively listened to discussion, occasionally provided inputs. I frequently contributed to discussion, or I led the discussion for most questions. And so option B to E is you're part of a group, but as you go down, you are taking more and more of an active role in that group. In fact, option B is a very polite Canadian way of saying, you didn't do anything. I mean, you were in a group and someone said it's B, and you said, all right, it's B. I'll go with that. So based on their self-reports of their role in the group, I was interested, well, how does that translate into academic performance, both in the short and the long term? So here are the weekly quiz scores of those students who reported doing the quizzes on their own for whatever, and it was a variety of reasons. What happens when you add people to a group? Not surprisingly, the scores go up. If you have 4 people working on a quiz, they do better than 1 person on average. But what's interesting is that I think groups change a bit. And interestingly, the more you tend to contribute actively to a group, the higher even your weekly quiz scores. Okay. Now, the real question, I told you that the midterm and the final exam is cumulative and it's in person, you're on your own and there's no study aids. So it's a true test of how well have you actually mastered the concepts. So on the final exam, this is how are doing during the year, very low stakes. How do you do on the final exam? Well, if you wrote the quizzes on your own, it was a very good predictor of how you perform on the final exam. There's no tricks on the final exam. I tell the student, it's just like your weekly quizzes. If you were a leader in groups, you tend to do better. But if you didn't do much during the year, you did poorly on the final exam. And so I show students this data at the beginning of the year and said, of course you can write the quizzes in groups. You can do whatever you want, but you should take an active role. You can't just be passively receiving the information and telling yourself, yeah, I get it, and I'll get that on the final exam. You're not being metacognitively aware of your own learning. Okay, the second principle we'll talk about is called interleaving, and it connects to that problem-solving method that I talked about. Okay, Here's a very famous study by Cornell and Bjork. So in this study, participants have to learn a very challenging abstract task, and they have to learn it inductively. So if you're a participant, your job is to learn the artistic style of a dozen painters that you've never heard of before. So Judy Hawkins, Philip Juras, Ryan Lewis, etc. They all have a characteristic style of their painting. The final test will be, I'm going to show you brand new paintings that you have not seen before, and you have to say, aha, that is a Judy Hawkins, or aha, that is a George Wexler painting if I've ever seen one before, right? So it's a complex task. And there's no instructor that's going to say, do you see the fine lines here? That's very characteristic of a Wexler painting. No, you're going to just learn this on your own. And the way that you're going to learn this is one of two ways. One group, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of Pisani paintings. So you kind of get the feel. Can you get the feel of a Pisani painting? Once you've gone through that, then I'll say, okay, here's a Wexler, here's another Wexler, here's another Wexler. And then here's a Hawkins, another Hawkins, another Hawkins. This is called block learning. I'm going to show you all the paintings by Pisani, all the paintings by Wexler, all the paintings by Hawkins, and then go on for all 12 artists. That's blocked. The mixed condition is going to be a lot more challenging. I'm going to show you one painting by Pisani, then one by Wexler, then one by Hawkins, then one by Cross, one by Drew, and your head might be spinning at some point. How am I supposed to keep track of all of this? So between these two conditions, block and mix, it's the same total number of trials. Both groups are going to see the same paintings. The question is, which of these two conditions would you rather be in? The blocked or the mixed? How many people say blocked? Okay. And how many people say mixed? Okay. Most people are saying blocked. Mixed is going to be a lot harder to sit through. Now, if the final test, like I said, is we're going to show you new paintings that you have not seen during this learning trial, and you have to say which artist painted these. Okay. Now, block practice generally feels good because that's how we learn things in school. So you might learn about fractions in one unit, and then guess what? All the test questions at the end of the chapter, it's about fractions. And then you might learn about decimals, and then guess what? All the questions at the end of that chapter, they're all about decimals. If we look at this at a university research method setting, you might learn about the t-test. And then guess what? At the end of that chapter, all of the review questions, the answer is use the t-test, plug in the numbers. And then you might learn about a Wilcoxon rank test. And then guess what? All the questions at the end, the answer is use Wilcoxon ranked. And you're just plugging in numbers. So there's not a lot of thinking, actually. It's just plugging in numbers into this format. So that's blocked learning. But the real test on the final exam, the question is not going to say, use a t-test to figure out if this is significant, or use a Wilcoxon rank test, or use a chi-square. The actual test questions on the final exam, here's a data set. What should you do? And students have no idea. Well, I don't know. Like, no one's telling me which test this is, but that's the whole point of a statistics course. Actually plugging in the numbers is high school level math. The thinking, the discriminating, which test should I use, that's the real heavy lifting. So when you ask participants in this study, which of these two conditions you think will do better, everyone thinks, of course, I'll do better in blocked, but it's the opposite. The mixed condition that's harder to go through, they significantly outperform the block crew, even though they have the same time on task, they're learning the same materials, the same examples. So when students are studying, do you know what students study? They usually study the easiest thing first. So if there are 10 chapters, and I'll say, oh, what are you studying? Oh, I'm studying chapter 7. Why are you studying chapter 7? It's my favorite. I love it. What you should actually be studying is the chapters that you know the least. That's where you should invest most of your time. But what do people like do? They like doing the easy thing. And so students also study in blocks. They learn everything about the t-test. They do a whole bunch of practice questions on the t-test. Then they learn everything about the chi-square. They do a whole bunch of practice questions, etc. That's block practice. What should you do? You should mix things up because that's what's going to happen on the final exam. So to give another analogy with motor learning, I kind of got back into baseball the last couple of years because of all the rule changes. One of the hardest things is for a batter to watch the pitcher throw the ball, and then they have to make adjustments to hit the ball. There's different types of pitches the pitcher can do. They can throw a fastball, and they can throw something called a changeup. It looks like a fastball, but it comes in much slower. It means you have to swing differently. So if you're at batting practice and you only practice fastball after fastball after fastball, and you got that, and then you practice changeup after changeup after changeup, and you master that, and you think, I'm ready for the game. No. The day of the test, the day of the game, the pitcher's going to try to trick you. Maybe they'll throw a fastball. Maybe they'll throw a changeup. Maybe they'll throw another type of pitch that they have. And it's your job as the batter to discriminate, pick up the cues, and make the correct adjustments for that pitch. If you never practice that in batting practice, you will not be able to do well on the day of the test in the game. And so when it comes to review questions, at the end of chapter 3, most of the questions perhaps should be about chapter 3, the Wilcoxon rank test. But maybe some of the questions, the answer should be, you got to use a t-test. You've got to use Wilcoxon rank test or ANOVA. So it has to draw upon information from before. You have to make a judgment. So that's interleaving. It promotes discrimination-based learning. So interleave practice makes things up. Sorry, my voice is going a little bit. So when you're trying to solve a problem, choosing a strategy is hard because students have to figure out what is the strategy and then infer. So rearrange the terms so the x is alone on one side. They got to figure this out. But if every question that comes, the answer is, oh, rearrange the terms so x is alone on one side, there's not any more thinking involved. It becomes a very passive process. So choosing a strategy is hard because problems that look alike might actually require different strategies. So Pythagorean theorem, not Pythagorean theorem. And if you kind of just go along with it, you might make a mistake. It can also be hard because problems that may look alike may actually require that may not look alike may require the same strategy. So these are all things that are learned during interleaving and discrimination learning. Here's a couple examples from my class. So we carefully craft thoughtful review questions that connect concepts across weeks. So here's a question. How does tonotopic organization of sound, which we're discussing right now this week, differ from topographic organization of vision, which we discussed last week? So this serves multiple purposes. Tonotopic and topographic are things that students could get confused about. There's certainly overlap in themes, but they're also different. And I also want them to learn that the things that you learned last week, you can't just forget about it. It's still relevant to us understanding how the overall brain works, for example. I encourage students to actually use the ones that we provide or create their own flashcards, or there's apps that they can use. And once they go through them initially, I encourage students, mix them up. Don't just go in the exact order that feels comfortable to you. Make yourself a little bit uncomfortable and mix up the order of the flashcards so that is better representative of what's going to happen on the actual test day. Okay, the third and final point I want to make is using spacing to strengthen long-term retention. Okay, so this has to do with cramming. Here's a study by Cornell where participants had to learn new vocabulary words for a GRE standardized test. So they had to learn inculcate. And there were two different groups. Both groups studied for the same total amount of time. They only differed in how that time was spaced out. So they both had the test. One group crammed 8 study sessions 1 day before the test. The other group took those same 8 study sessions, but they did them twice a day over the 4 days leading to the test. So in total, same time on task, same methods of what they're actually doing. The only thing we're changing is the spacing of what they're doing. And what Cornell demonstrates is that it makes a difference. By not cramming and just spreading that out, the same amount of studying time over multiple sessions, it significantly improves performance. And there's lots of interesting theoretical reasons. But one of the points I drive home to my students is that I'm not even trying to get you to study more. I want you to take the same amount that you would have studied the night before and just spread it out over a few sessions. And if you just make that adjustment, you will do better. Okay. So what's going on here? This is actually, it's a very old literature in cognitive psychology. People are really interested in what is it about spacing things out between study sessions that lead to better retention at the final test. And the further away that final test is, spacing seems to become even more important if you really want to retain it for the long term. So in spacing, if you have one study session, when you get to the second study session, there's some forgetting of the details from the previous study session. So you go through kind of a bit of this difficult phase where you have to go through and recapture that sense of fluency. And then third study session, again, there's some details you forget that you have to actually retrieve, etc. If you just have one big study session, you never go through that experience. You only experience fluency. You can read the words faster and faster and faster. And so there's no forgetting or retrieval of details. So believe it or not, going through a bit of a struggle between study sessions is a good thing. It helps to strengthen the final retention of that memory. So you've probably heard of something called the forgetting curve. You learn something and then it rapidly decays over time. The idea with spacing is that we do have that first reminder, and then we have that second reminder, and then we have that third study session, and perhaps that fourth study session. What we're trying to do is alter the trajectory of that forgetting curve. And so research by Ross and Dunlosky demonstrates that if you can have and they're trying to get this done, what's the exact number of study sessions you have to have? They found that 2 or 3 seems to be the sweet spot. If you have flashcards, let's say you could boil down everything you need to know into this pile of flashcards. You go through them once until you get them all correct, truly correct, not just reading. And then you go through them again until you get them correct again, and then you're done. And then you come back the next day and you repeat. And you come back the next day and you repeat once more. If you do that for 3 study sessions, it really helps to lock in this understanding for long-term retention. And they've demonstrated that this extends to even 1 month after the final exam. Students retain that information. Okay, here's another example of spacing. So in my course, Introduction to Psychology, they really only learn 4 things, but over and over again across different types of contexts. They learn it across audition, they learn it across vision, they learn it across evolutionary psychology. So I keep revisiting these themes that are spaced out across the course so that we do another pass at this, but just from a different context. So that's another example of spacing. So the big three that I talked about is using retrieval practice to consolidate that initial memory. You can't just passively read or highlight. You have to be an active contributor to your own learning. It consolidates that initial memory. We could use interleaving to discriminate problem-solving methods, and we could use spacing to strengthen long-term retention. And I showed you several examples of how you can do this as an instructor, but it's also something that the student has to take on as well. Quick question for you, especially for those who attended my workshop yesterday. What are the habits that lead to a healthy lifestyle? Dale? Sleep. Sleep is one. What else? Exercise? Diet? Anything else?
Offloading tasks.
Offloading tasks. Okay. Here's my question. Are you doing all of these things? Yes? One person, yes. Everyone else, probably not, right? So students are the same. Even when they know the theory of what is good for them, when human beings are given a choice between something that's more difficult or less difficult, they will opt for the less difficult path. So spacing, interleaving, and testing, it's what's called a desirably difficult process. So students think learning and progress looks like this. It's harder. Everything I talked about is harder to do. It's the more difficult choice. It's so much easier to just study what you already know and just kind of passively do it. And then you could tell yourself, look, I put in the hours. But doing interleaving, doing retrieval practice, spacing it out, it's harder to do. It would be much easier to do a simpler method. So that is the question that how do you get students to do that? Well, as an instructor, in part, I think we're life coaches too. And so when we talk about this before the midterm, I tell students, okay, doesn't matter what you did up to this point. We have a midterm coming up on Friday. Here's what I want everyone to do right now. Everyone, open up your calendar, whether it's a paper calendar or on your phone or computer. Mark down when the midterm is on Friday. Okay, today's Monday. I want you to estimate, look at your calendar, look at your schedule, estimate how much time you can devote to this task to prepare for the exam. And some students say, I'm just going to keep studying until I know everything. Well, you probably have other things you need to do. You might have other midterms. You might have other obligations. So you can't leave it open-ended. I want you to look in your calendar right now and make a commitment to how much time you can realistically devote. Maybe some people say I can devote 10 hours, maybe 6 hours, maybe less. It depends. But whatever it is, I want you to look and actually pick a number. Now, I want you to divide this number into 3 or 4 study session blocks. And then I want you to actually put it in your calendar. Make an appointment. Tuesday, 10:30 to 11:30, study psychology. Wednesday, 1 to 2 p.m., study for psychology midterm, etc. And then if you want, you could do this for other things. And it takes a few minutes to do this in class. And what students tell me after the midterm is that, as silly as it sounds, as silly as I felt, if we didn't do it in class at that point, I never would have done it. And I would have probably said, yeah, I should do that, but I never would have actually done it. It took that prodding, that coaching. Do they all do it? No, but a lot of them do. And then they say, you know what? I think I might do this for my other courses. I'm like, good idea. Really good idea. Okay. Do you guys want to see a quick look at some new data? Okay, it'll just take a few minutes. Okay. During the pandemic, we're interested in, what happens online. Like, I'm sure when you're teaching online, were the cameras on or off from the students? Yeah, generally off, right? And you kind of suspected, what are they doing? Are they actually paying attention? We want to systematically look at how that actually affects things. So here's your study design. Online class. In one condition, everyone's webcam is on. Okay, they had no choice. It automatically turned everyone's webcam on. Another condition, everyone's webcam is automatically off. You have no choice. Another condition, some students' individual webcams are off, but everyone else's is on. So you don't have a choice about this. So your webcam is off. And then we can measure all sorts of different things, but I'll boil it down to one measure. How well do they do on the test? for this lesson. Okay, so this is how it looks. Here's this student. Everyone's webcam is on during this online class, and here's a presentation going on. Here's another condition. This student, their webcam is off. Other people's webcams are on. And the third condition, everyone's webcam is off. Okay, everyone gets the same lesson. Everyone gets the same test. Here's the question. What are your predictions? Which of these groups, what is the order of performance? How do you think people do on these tests?
Works on the webcams or a bit well.
Who does the best?
Best when it's
Green? Okay. Everyone's webcam on. Would everyone say that's probably the best group? Yes. Okay. What's the worst group? Everyone's webcam off? Okay. So this group, we're looking at the people that have their webcam off, but other people have their webcam on. Where do you think they perform? In the middle?
Best.
You think they perform the best? That's interesting. Why?
Because you're not looking at yourself. I think
Okay.
you spend too much time looking.
Okay, because people feel self-conscious, maybe. Any other predictions? Okay, yeah. All right, here's what actually happened. Here's when the webcams are off, right? Here's when the webcams are on. People do better, okay? The really interesting group was the people who had their webcam off, but everyone else has their webcam on. They do the worst. They actually did the worst. What is going on? I don't know. Maybe they're not actually doing anything. Maybe they realize, hey, other people have their webcam on. If the instructor asks a question, they'll take care of it. I have my webcam off. I don't really have to do anything. So, you know, when you're in a faculty meeting and someone has their camera off, they're probably not paying attention. That's what I'm thinking. They're not paying attention. They're not going to volunteer for anything. They're going to leave it to the rest of us who have our webcams on. We're expected to pick up the slack. And so I found this really fascinating that if you have your webcam off, okay, so evidence of benefit when students can see their classmates via webcam and their own and have their own webcam on. If you have your webcam off, but other people have them on, it might hinder your learning. And we also have evidence from other studies that the behavior of other people in a classroom, but even online, if you have other people that are looking engaged, paying attention, it influences you. It influences how well you think this lecture is going. It influences how motivated you are to learn and whether you'll take future courses. But those are a whole bunch of other studies that we did that I don't have time to show you. Okay, let's circle back. So I had this motivated learner. She wanted to empty out the fridge. I said, we can't do that. Can you think of another solution? And she sat there for a moment, and then Monica said, I know what we're going to do. Let me borrow your phone. We're going to make a movie.
This is an experiment for what? For see if the fridge turns off.
The light turns off when we close the fridge?
Yeah.
Here we go.
The mystery is solved. Thank you so much. If you are interested in any of the things that I talked about in this presentation, you could check out maccontrolsec.com. I've got a few resources there, some online lectures. There's a Science of Learning web module that is used in my course that your students might find very helpful for preparing for any type of studying, for any course that they're taking. And I just want to plug, I organized the 12th McMaster Conference on Education and Cognition. If you kind of like the themes of what I talked about, how cognition can help us understand instructional design, teaching, and educational practices, please come out. We also have a journal club that you can join us remotely. You could join the conference in person or remotely as well. And thank you very much.